Welcome to the Myth, Legend and Lore podcast. Today I have a wonderful guest on the podcast. Fredrik is a Nordic Tribal artist from Sweden who is currently living in Scotland. Combining electronic music with traditional Scandinavian and Celtic instruments, he creates music in a narrative form to bring the listener on a story. His first album in this saga, Västerled, was released on the 7th of November 2018. Inspired by archetypal symbolism and the spiritual heritage of Northern Europe, through the character of Torulf, Fredrik tells esoteric stories of setting sail on a mythical journey. Fredrik, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Not at all. Firstly, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the concept of Nordic tribal music and some of the inspiration behind Västerled.
Yeah, for sure. So Nordic tribal music is something that I just put a tag on, essentially, on the kind of music that I want to create. Mm-hmm. I'd say that concisely that Nordic tribal is an experimental fusion genre combining electronic music with traditional Northern European instruments. So I would say that it blends kind of electronic sounds of electronic ambient or something from neofolk or techno, dark ambient, with traditional instruments such as the baran of the Celtic culture or the tagelharpa of Scandinavia.
I have to say, when you're listening to the album, it all works so seamlessly. It really does, and the kind of older elements of the music and modern, it doesn't feel like there's a clashing at all. It really comes together so well.
Thank you very much. It's something that I've been working on for the last few years, actually, trying to find that sweet spot in between. I was never of trying to imitate a genre or to fully grasp something that was already there, but my mind has always been on how do I piece something together, or how do I weave two different factors, as it were, together and see what's new and something novel could be created.
I'd say that you've absolutely achieved that, and I'm really looking forward to when we're going to be playing some clips today as well. So when you were writing the album, how did you approach it? Was there a kind of visual journey for you?
Yeah, so the album, just in my way of creating music, was very different from how I've done before. Whereas before I created a song or a piece of music, and then I added meaning on top of it afterwards. But with this album, I really had to think on what I wanted to express, what I wanted to narrate, or what kind of story do I want to let the audience experience. So my approach was that before I even wrote a single piece of music, I had this outline of the grander story, this red thread for the audience and also for myself to follow through this album. And I had a lot of influences from Joseph Campbell's A Hero with 1,000 Faces, and those concepts that he wrote about.
No, that's something I'm really looking forward to discussing. I'm a big fan of that book as well, I have to say. And I think the reason I was kind of wondering how you can visualise the journey is often when I'm writing, I'll listen to music. It sometimes helps me to work out a character's motives or the storyline, and some of my favourite scenes that I've written, it comes from listening to a piece of music over and over again. And when I was listening to your album, it had a really visual element for me. I think that's something that your audience will really appreciate as well.
Yeah, music for me is very, very visual. It doesn't have to be my own music, but when I listen to a piece from any type of genre, I have this tendency of seeing a scene or like a play right in front of me, and that plays a huge part in the creation process of my album. Whereas the story itself, for me, is a very physical journey. Whereas the character of Torulf goes from one place to another, and in order for me to fully express that, I had to translate the visual imagery that I see before me into music and into sound.
Oh no, it's absolutely fascinating. It really is. Well, I think that I'm actually really looking forward to how we're going to get into this discussion a little bit further. And just for the audience, Fredrik and I thought the best way for you guys to experience Torulf's journey is from not only listening to us discuss it, but also to the album itself. And so without further ado, let us venture into Västerled. And the first chapter of the album is Nya Tidseldern.
So Nya Tidseldern is where the story begins. It begins with a new awakening from a forgotten time. The chaotic conditions awaken the primordial sea. Waves are formed and new colors mixes into the monochromatic waters. Movement and possibilities emerge in the new age.
So I think the thing that really struck me when I was listening to the first chapter, it really reminded me of the creation myth. But it also there's another story in Celtic myth as well, and it was when you were describing waves and water, and that plays an essential part in one of the creation stories. So what was the inspiration for you behind this first part?
My inspiration was mostly derived from the creation myth of Norse mythology. In particular, the conditions and what's being described as Ginnungagap, which is the gaping abyss or the vast abyss, where primordial beings exist, and it's a place of chaos. It's a place of almost, to me, like cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. It's so vast and it's so strange and bizarre that you might go insane just by being there and looking at it. And like, how do you grasp the vastness? So to me, I kind of wanted to express that kind of bubbling, wavy essence of what it means to hear a primordial sea. I wanted to start the album with a sort of a sense of wonder and sort of almost a strange kind of opening where you feel like almost anything is possible from this point on. And you don't really know exactly where to go with this as an audience hearing this. It's like, okay, well, there's so many different directions where you can go from the primordial sea, basically any, right?
Absolutely.
So I really wanted that sense of wonder and awe to be a part of my opening in this album.
Yeah, I would say it's very powerful. Shall we move on to the next chapter, and that is Leaf?
So Leaf is the chapter of the creation of form, nature, and earth. Amongst the growing trees, there are whispers in the wind, breaths that create life. Torulf inhales for the first time and falls into ecstasy.
remember in one of our first discussions when you told me that leaf means life, and that really struck a chord with me, actually. And when I'm listening back to that track, I can really imagine the voices or the presence of Odin and Vili and Ve, and their actions and breathing life and essence and sight, and even the appearance into the first man and woman, which was Ask and Embla. It's such a powerful part of the track.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly right. The main source of inspiration in this chapter is when Odin, Vili, and Ve in the Norse mythology created Ask and Embla out of trees of their respective names.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to tell a sort of how that would actually feel like to be created, and the process of being formed out of something. And to me, that process and that feeling is ecstatic. It's something that is very, very powerful. My mind was so set on trying to create on how that would actually feel like.
Yeah.
So this song is deeply connected to the creation of a being, whether that be a tree or a rock, a mountain, or a human being.
I wonder if we can touch on ecstasy just for a moment, and where Torulf is taking his first breath. Is he experiencing an altered state? Is he outside of his physical self?
Exactly. What I thought of when I wrote this piece of music was that to be able to inhale for the first time in your life, it has to be a sort of ecstatic moment where you fall into a sort of altered state of mind. That to me says that when you experience that, you fall into a sort of, you fall into ecstasy. And that word is also very deeply connected to the god Odin as well, where he's the god of ecstasy. He's the god of very, very powerful emotions of being expressed quite madly sometimes, but that comes with it, I think.
So the next chapter that we're going to play is Phase 2.
So Phase 2 is where intuitive insights gets tested. Before he sets sail, Torulf must find out what he knows deep within himself. His knowledge is thrown back at him, testing him in a shamanic and unforgiving manner.
Shamanism is something that I find really interesting, and I'm still discovering quite a lot about, and we can find traces of it in the myths about Odin, like for example his quest for knowledge and learning the language of runes. Is Torulf undergoing a challenging or possibly a grueling rite in order to learn what he needs for his journey?
That's exactly right. My ideas for this track was to express a sort of almost unforgiven shamanic practice. Whereas I've always been somewhat interested in the process of shamanism, and to have your knowledge essentially being tested, and to really think about what you know about things, about the world, and about yourself. I think that in this song, Torulf has the need of going almost into a cave or into the shaman hut that is outside of the tribe, and goes there to perform some sort of ritual, to perform some sort of rite where he's almost being torn apart in what he knows to really get to the bottom, into the essence of what he wants and what he wants to do before he actually sets out on his adventure.
So is it kind of like a breaking down, a kind of way of preparation for what is to come?
Exactly. The name of the song, Veistu, is Icelandic and Old Norse, and it means "Do you know?"
Okay.
And it's derived from the Håvamål, where Odin asks people like, "Do you know how to send them? Do you know how to carve them? Do you know how to," and etc. And I took some inspiration from that poem, but put it into a shamanic kind of context. And consequently, it's more or less the more aggressive chapter in the album. But I think that it also plays into the concept of ecstasy, where you choose to get sent into an altered state, where everything you know gets questioned, and that itself can be quite unforgiven, but it's very shamanic in nature.
When I was researching, I found that shamans of many cultures use a drum, and the beating allows the shaman to achieve that altered state. When listening to your album as well, that beat, that drum carries on through. It's almost like it's a continual kind of rite or process. I also found in Celtic myth and legends the bodhrán was used as a battle drum to keep warriors in cadence, and also there's a brilliant piece of Scandinavian folklore on what's called Troma, and so that's basically the sound of drums that supernatural beings played to aid those who were facing conflict, and hearing their drums in the distance was seen as a warning or of impending battle or danger.
The drum is so primal. Really, once you hear a beating skin drum, you almost get sent to an altered state already. I think that's deeply coded or related to us as human beings, and that's something that has been used all around the world in tribal communities. Especially in shamanic and ritual practices, and it doesn't really surprise me that the bodhrán has been used for or in a warlike context, where you have to get hyped up to go into battle, and you have to feel that sort of aggressiveness and being almost pulled out from an individual sense and become part of this larger group, become part of this larger army, and so you can perhaps fight more as a unit. And if every single warrior is connected to this bodhrán, to this skin drum, then you all kind of share the same heartbeat in a way.
I began to think as well as the drum kind of resembling a heartbeat. You are a warrior, and this is kind of, inciting you into battle and things. You can understand why your own heartbeat would pick up to that sound as well. And then there are also some cultures who will decorate the skin of the drum, and they will tell some of their myths or legends, and the drum is actually seen as a very sacred item to them.
Yeah, for sure. I actually have a skin drum here at home where me and my friend have painted a bind room, and once every time where we play on it, it certainly adds to the feeling of doing so. So I can definitely relate to that. Another thing that I wanted to explore more with Veistu, in accordance to or related to using a skin drum, is that with this Nordic tribal idea of fusing modern sounds and traditional sounds, was that I used a techno kick as the fundamental drum instrument in the song, and it got up, and it reminded me of a text I wrote a few years ago before the album, where I thought of techno as the 21st century drum circle.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just replace the DJ with a shaman, for instance, and the techno kick is a skin drum, and you see all these people standing and they're dancing and they're going into a trance-like state, and they're going somewhere in their minds or in their spiritual being. But I see very little difference with that, as if a shaman around a campfire, say, and you have the tribe people dancing around, and they're all dancing and they're going into a trance-like state, for instance.
There is something that happens to people when they are together and they hear music or a beat, or there's some kind of synchronicity between them all, and it is quite incredible to watch.
For sure. And I think that with genres like techno, it makes more sense, at least to me, that now I can see a clear relation to the ancient times with the shaman and the skin drum and by the campfire, and now we have nightclubs.
Yeah, exactly.
But I can see like how they're connected, and that's very interesting to me.
Shall we move on to the next chapter, and that is Västerled?
So now the journey commences. Torulf sets sail towards the unknown, seeking adventure and spiritual truths. A hymn is sung for protection from the gods that sailed before him. With strong winds and high tides, he sails west.
You know, it's quite incredible. Every time I listen to the album, I kind of almost feel as if I'm getting something new from it again and learning more or kind of about the story. And certainly since we've been discussing mythology and some of the ideas that have inspired you, we kind of briefly touched on the archetype of the hero and Joseph Campbell. The journey that Torulf is embarking on, it might be the beginning of that arc, the beginning of the adventure.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What I wanted with this song was the call for adventure of the archetypical hero, so to speak. The wish and the choice to physically move from one place to another into the unknown in order to experience new things, in order to test yourself or to challenge yourself. And of course, you don't really know where you're going, but the decision to actually go somewhere, at least, is, to me, is somewhat is a decision worth being celebrated, or at least being heard. So what I wanted with this song is to really play into that narration of it always moves forward, and a big help for me into thinking about that conceptually was the hero's journey.
I think it takes a certain amount of bravery for a hero to answer the call, but then that journey that he does undertake, or that she undertakes, it's not without hardship or challenge. There's a lot to face along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think that actually leads us quite nicely into the next couple of chapters where this story takes a slight turn. There's, quite a lot happens from here. So the next track is Ufgalder.
So new shores are found, and Torulf reaches his destination. He invokes the spirits of the hunt and battle in order to celebrate his victory ceremoniously. He stomps hard into the ground so the sound travels far and wide, making his presence known. Torulf sings a howling song.
Well, I have to be honest, I think this is another favourite of mine. I think this is just an absolutely brilliant example of how you have so seamlessly worked modern influence into this. I think is exactly how the story should be told at this point, and it really does feel like it's a progression and something new. I actually really enjoy that track a lot.
Thank you very much. It was one of the first songs I made for the album, and I think that it has I've grown to like it more and more as well. And I think this is uh, one of the songs that I personally think that I merge the modern and the traditional sounds like well in the album, where that concept where that concept of Nordic tribal can really be heard and experienced.
And in your description there, you mentioned the spirits of the hunt, and that kind of made me think about the wild hunt from Norse mythology, where it's ghostly entities or supernatural riders. And I guess in Scandinavian kind of folklore, when you read about the wild hunt, it was thought that they appeared and it was a warning against, or to forewarn people against unrest or a time of war.
I can see how that plays into the story here in this chapter, where now Torulf has reached a destination. He has traveled over the ocean, over the seas, and reached an unknown land. And his instinct is to celebrate that, is to go on hunting and be ready for battle. He wants to run around in the forest as of a wolf pack or amongst the wolves. Just be part of this. Just be part of the nature of this new land.
Because it also made me think about animal and nature worship of Norse and Celtic cultures. And I was reading the other day, in fact, about how these cultures would have seen animals, and such as the raven, the wolf, or the eagle, and they would be seen as possessing wisdom, and they would therefore have been respected rather than viewed as subservient creatures. And the same with nature; it was respected. It was a primal force that could destroy just as well as it could provide for people.
That's very, very interesting. I haven't read so much about that in particular, but I can add that in many ancient spiritual beliefs, when you go into a sort of altered state or a shamanic practice, you take on the persona or the skin of an animal, and you sort of merge with say a bear or a horse or an elk or a wolf, and you use that the energy of that particular animal as a symbol for you to express or to do things. Like if you want to go out to hunt, then you want to personify a wolf, or if you want to be a source of justice or like a kingly man, then perhaps an elk would be the one that you want to have as a spirit animal or something. It's that kind of concept or ideas that I was inspired by with this song, where Ulfgalder, it literally means like the magical song of the wolf, where the galder is an ancient form of magic in the Old Norse traditions, and ulf is the Old Norse word for wolf. So I wanted to express that part of Torulf where he is in a new place, and in order to express some sort of gratitude or to celebrate his victory, he becomes his spirit animal, and that's why he sings this howling song in the beginning of the song. He sort of becomes part of another aspect of his being.
I know when we were reading Norse poems and tales of the heroes, wolves do feature in a lot of the stories. I think it's one of those animals where they're known to shapeshift as well, or people can slip on their skins and become the wolf, which I always think is just an incredibly interesting part of the story. And when you look at it actually in a few different mythologies and cultures, wolves play a big role, and they're also seen as one of the beasts of battle, along with the likes of the raven and the eagle. Traditionally, that's like the beast of battle is a poetic trope. These are the animals that are traditionally accompanied warriors and would feast on the bodies of the slain. But that's a slightly more gruesome kind of part of it. But I think the idea that animals played such a significant part in people's lives is really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And that's also somewhat what I wanted to express with this song as well. Is like, how would that sound like from a character's point of view?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that you'd have more freedom when you write about it, like in a novel or something like that. But when you do it in music, it's quite difficult to express that kind of transformation or that kind of animal worship, as it were, in these Norse and Celtic myths.
I think that you're right. It is more difficult, but you've absolutely done it, though. It really comes through in that particular song. So we'll move on to the next chapter, and that is Domer.
Now the journey reaches a standstill. There is no longer a clear path. Torulf asks himself what happens after a journey, what lives on afterwards. He's forced to hear echoes bouncing off hard truths. Life is in dark corners as the day of death dawns.
As we progress through the album, there are moments where you do feel like you're quite connected to Torulf, but in a moment like this, it feels like he's quite possibly the only person that is thinking or feeling or experiencing what's going on round about him just now. It's a very powerful part of the track.
Yeah, I only realized this after I made the album, but the darkest part of this album in this story, as it's come this far, is the second last song.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really think of that until I got every track finished. And I guess it made me think a lot about where I wanted this story to go and how to finish it, essentially,
mm-hmm.
Just in this album. And you're very keen on observing that Torulf is the only one experiencing and observing and feeling things in his world. Thus far, he's the only character in this world, and I think that creates a sort of intimacy with this character for the audience, where it's almost like they're beside him or inside his mind or just a part of him.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. You really do. It almost becomes quite a personal thing.
Yeah, it's the point in the story where he had achieved something. He had sailed west and he found new land, and he had already been victorious in what he wanted to achieve. And that happened in the previous chapter. So I thought it would be interesting to find out, or to explore rather, what would happen after you achieve something.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen after you have actually been victorious? And I wanted to explore in a narrative sense what that would be like, in order for me to, just on a personal level, how to challenge my own way of creating a story, where I could do a normal sort of narration of him going to an adventure and having hardships and then being victorious. But what if he actually achieves that in the middle of the album?
Mm-hmm.
What would the rest of the album be like and sound like? So I wanted it to be kind of bittersweet. And this song in particular, Dumur, I wanted to explore and to express what it would sound and feel like after you've done something. You might feel quite lost, or you might feel quite unsure of what you want to do now, as if you achieved the one thing that you set out to do, but essentially, what happens now?
Is there a sense of almost perhaps self-doubt or questioning his reasons for embarking on the journey? If this is all there is and I've done it, what does that mean for the future, or what is my legacy?
Exactly right. It's almost like facing your own death in a way, where you think that you've lived a full life, and now that you've reached a point where you can't really see a clear path, then something that you've done, something from your past, has to be let go, mm-hmm. in order for you to continue forward.
Mm-hmm. It made me kind of wonder about fate as well, and that played a really kind of big part in Norse mythology and in Norse belief itself. The idea that fate is kind of predestined, and it can't be changed, and you can only accept what is coming your way, but the best way to live is to live your life well. In that sense, if the adventure is over, what does that then mean for the rest of your life? It's kind of, that was one other thing that kind of crept in while I was thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea to have about it, is that if you accept that your life is fated, but do you still go out on adventures? Do you still challenge yourself? Perhaps you do, and that's great. But what if you thought something was fated to you, a sort of huge happening or a huge event that you were part of, and you lived through it, but you didn't go to another realm and dine with the gods. So mm-hmm. you sort of feel that you're stuck somewhere, and that's something that I want to explore with music, how that would essentially sound like and feel like, that sort of questioning your own fate, essentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea to explore, because if we are, watching a film or we're reading a book or something like that, traditionally the end of the movie is the end of the adventure, and generally speaking, most things end very well, and we don't really think too much longer after that fact about what happens to the lives of everybody kind of involved. And for me, certainly as a reader or listening to your album, I want to know what happens next and what's the next part of the story.
Yeah, me too, for sure. And I sort of challenge myself as a creator to have that as the second to last chapter. It's like, well, where do you go from the darkest chapter if you only have one chapter left?
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to have that as a challenging part for myself as someone who likes to make music, essentially.
Shall we move on to the last chapter, which is Right of the Heart?
Yeah. So Right of the Heart, I would describe it as, imagine a half moon that shines between the trees on a freshly hunted animal. The ritual commences. Blood drips between Torulf's fingers and down his blade. Two crows gather and witness the heart. The forgotten past and a future promise is woven together in the present. The journey is not yet over. Whispers in the wind calls to him, rise.
Well, I think with this chapter, you can sense that there is an absolute shift in the story again. That was really powerful once more, my goodness. So it feels like this is a real time of transformation.
Yeah. This is essentially the part of the story where you are being reborn, or you have a spiritual kind of rebirth, where you have gone off to an adventure and you've been victorious and you feeling lost, and after that you undergo some sort of spiritual rebirth, where if you have taken a physical journey, moving from point A to point B to point C, and you've experienced a lot of huge events or great happenings in your life, where would you go afterwards? So I wanted this last chapter in Västerled, to be more of a focus on the concept of going, or the transition between a physical journey to a metaphysical experience.
So if we were to look at it in the kind of the cycle of the hero's adventure, I feel that there's still so much more to come that we haven't reached by any means. Even the midway point or towards the end of Torulf's journey.
Yeah, I would say that this whole album is more of an origin story.
Oh, okay.
In the grand scheme of things, where I really want to take this story and make more albums, in the sense of moving the story forward and taking it to new realms and new dimensions, where I can fully explore some ideas that I've had boiling in my kettle for quite some time now.
Mm-hmm.
So this song is, to me at least, is a transitional chapter, a sort of a cliffhanger, if you will, into into the coming albums.
My goodness. And is that something that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I started working on it maybe a few weeks before I released this album, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Some ideas were just coming to me quite naturally after I finished this album. And I have a somewhat abstract ideas of where I want to take this story and what I want to express. So you could see right of the heart this last chapter as the transition into the next album.
Are there elements that are going to cross over? Are we going to kind of venture a little bit more into the shamanism and ecstasy again?
Yeah, I would say that we would venture more into the esoteric and metaphysical realm, where if Västerled has been a physical journey, then the next album would be more of a personal, spiritual experience and or journey. I take influences from Nordic shamanism, but also from reading about mystical experiences and practices from Hinduism or Tibetan mysticism. I'm kind of trying to see what I can connect and what could influence or inspire my own story.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to see how that translates into music, because those are some really interesting concepts to investigate. And I think that, just from listening what you've done with Västerled, you absolutely bring that into your next album, and definitely something I would invite you to come back on and discuss again, because it's just it's pretty mind-blowing when you get down to it and start talking about some of the ideas that you've got running through this.
Thank you very much. I'll be happy to come on in the future as well.
Oh, that would be marvelous. And so, how do you see Nordic tribal music progressing for you?
That's a good question. The thing is, I'd like this term to be semi-loose. I want it to be more of a compass, or more of a thing that you can navigate through soundscapes. I'd see this as more of a call for exploration rather than trying to imitate or trying to reproduce.
Yeah.
I'd much rather like Nordic Tribal to be somewhat its own kind of organism or its own life that you can have as a inspiration in terms of how to weave different sounds together, or how to think about how to use a tagelharpa in a modern sense, or in a different sense than it has already been used for, and just trying to let it inspire to create something new out of something old, essentially.
From reading some of the reviews on Bandcamp website, people are really, really interested in what you're doing, and it's striking a chord as well. And so that is an incredibly rewarding thing when you know that something that you've created is touching people.
For sure. It's gone over expectations, this whole album launch. I essentially didn't have any expectations when I released it. By the time that I just clicked upload, I was like, okay, now I can finally relax. It's been a year. I can finally think of some other projects and like where to take this next.
Yeah.
But I could never imagine the amount of interest and the positive feedback that I got from it. It's deeply heartwarming to read all the comments, to see what people get from the music, and sometimes it's very spot on what people say. That it's actually quite amazing to read.
I think sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming as well. It's such an incredible feeling to know that you have finished that project and you think, okay, I can sit down and I can breathe for a little bit. That sometimes doesn't really happen though. It just seems to snowball and it becomes something else. I find when it's a creative endeavour, it never truly ever stops.
Yeah, for sure. And the most scariest part is right before you publish something or you release something, because you know every little nook and cranny of what you've written or what you made, and you can see all the positive, but also all the negative aspects of it. And as a creator, you feel like, okay, well, perhaps people will see more of the negative things that you see as well. But that's just a threshold that you just have to get over and just to release it. And once you do that, it sort of stops being your own thing that you almost hoard in the end, and you just have to release it into the wild.
Absolutely, let it loose.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to be honest, I do. I find the same. When I'm writing, you create these worlds and these characters. You give them thoughts and feelings and emotions and storylines and everything like that. And then you need to know where to draw the line in telling everybody everything about the character and just letting them use their imaginations as well. Is an important part of the process too.
For sure, for sure. And it actually reminds me of something that my brother told me a month after I released the album, when I told him essentially what I've been talking about now, about what each chapter is about and the story behind it and the meanings. And he said, well, I think that you've released half of your album, and the other half is this story that you have. And perhaps it would be interesting also to talk about and to release in some form that other half of the album.
Well, that would be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how to do that, how to do that best, essentially. But it's opportunities like this, like coming onto your show and asking me questions and having a discussion about it, that lets me open up about the story. And I'm truly thankful for that.
Not at all. I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure, Fredrik. I know what it's like to appear on podcasts, and there's, the nerves beforehand and things, but there's also that sense of excitement that you're going to be talking about something and discovering another person's ideas and things. And for me, that's always the most exciting part of any podcast. Especially when it's a shared topic where you have interests that are, relatively the same, that there's some common element that you can draw from. And today's certainly been fantastic. I really can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'll gladly be back on if you like me.
Oh, absolutely. One last thing before we go, I would just, any links at all to websites or ways to get in contact with you so that the audience can go and find your album and, download it for themselves and listen at home?
Yeah, for sure. So in order to download the album, it's available for purchasing on Bandcamp. And that's a good way of supporting my work, and all that money goes directly to the budget for my next album as well. So the other thing would be, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram and on YouTube as well, and you can listen to all of the songs and all of the albums and some other songs as well that are not on the album on Twitter and on YouTube and Spotify.
And I will include the links to the various social media accounts and Bandcamp at the end of the episode in the description as well. So they will take you directly to the various places that Fredrik's mentioned. Usually, with an episode, I'll finish with a piece of myth, legend, or lore. But today we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to conclude this episode with a chapter from Västerled. And I have to admit, this chapter is an absolute favourite of mine, and I couldn't have been happier when Fredrik suggested that we play Live. thank you for joining me on the podcast today. As always, you can get in touch via Twitter @LoreMyth or email mlegendlore@gmail.com. I'm Siobhan Clark, and this is the Myth, Legend and Lore podcast.